Thanks again for inviting us. We are going to be talking about library UX transitioning from physical to online. As mentioned, we just mentioned this briefly in the bio. We had the secondment post of library UX and engagement coordinator from August 2019 to January 2021, which was a job share, an equal job share with Sinead. You've already given us a bit of a brief bio, so we probably won't spend too much time on this slide. Sinead, did you want to?
No, just to say hello to everyone. I think Tulio's already given us a great introduction, so there's no point in repeating what everybody already knows. But yes, let's just chat about the work that we did. I think it's the most interesting part.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll just briefly talk about the previous work that we did, because that did really inform a lot of the ways we actually came into the role and decided to formulate our techniques, essentially. So we went into the role with some exposure to the formation, implementation and analysis of UX techniques, because the library had done previous techniques before. We were basically testing the waters before the role was created, and it was a really great way to implement techniques and gain some experience and knowledge of how UX in libraries work and whether it would be useful for our libraries in order to improve our student services, which is our focus. We applied two popular techniques, which you may have heard of before, which were cognitive mapping and love letters to the library. Essentially, cognitive mapping is giving students piece of paper and asking them to draw a map of the library, but using 3 different coloured pencils. We gave them 2 minutes for each colour, and the premise behind that was what they drew in the first colour was the most important to them, and what they drew in the last colour was the least important to them. Then we also did love letters and breakup letters to the library. We formulated that around Valentine's Day, and we made up a lot of cards with some sort of library themed love themed messages. So you can see Dewey, you love me. And we essentially asked the students to write messages to the library as a person, hopefully starting them with Dear Library. We gave them an incentive of an Amazon voucher, and then I think we gave Amazon vouchers to the 3 best ones that we found that were written, basically. So you can see here just a couple of examples. We've got like, Dear Library, you are there for me 24/7. Your pink structures are taking me to heaven. You listen to me line by line. My heart is yours and I hope you're mine. I love your minimal aesthetic. So we got a lot of really interesting letters. These ones are obviously love letters, but we did get some breakup letters as well. And we found mainly they were about, what we found is the theme started to emerge and the pattern started to emerge, which in this case was, the temperature was a real big problem that we hadn't noticed before. But it did really help us to formulate the projects going forward into the role by being exposed to these sort of projects previous to the role. And you can see some of the maps as well with the different colours. So what they drew in the first colour was most important, and what they drew last was what we figured was least important to them. Let's have a look. Yep, once in role, we moved to doing on-site projects, which I'll pass over to Sinead.
Thank you, Aimee. Yeah, so with all that great previous work that had already been done within the university, within the library, once the secondment role began, Aimee and I were given a specific brief to look at space and communications within the library. What essentially we wanted to do was to see our space and service through the eyes of our users, to understand their perception of the library and their needs, and also to reflect upon their thoughts so that we could improve our service spaces and engagement. It's quite a broad scope, so we had to really sit down and think about what techniques would be best suited in order to gain this understanding from our users. So we researched different UX techniques. We also benchmarked and looked at the work that some other institutions were doing. And essentially we then planned 3 main projects for the academic year ahead. So I'll just briefly talk about the 3 projects that were planned for that academic year. The first one was a graffiti wall, and this took place in induction week. The idea was that we wanted to engage with our users and to understand their needs and expectations, particularly when first arriving at the university. So we were hoping this would primarily be engaged with by first-year students. The graffiti wall in itself, just to explain it, is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a physical installation where users could pose questions and share their thoughts on a wall. So you can see the picture on this slide shows the graffiti wall at one of our campuses, where people were essentially graffitiing questions about the library and thoughts about the library. Why did we choose this technique? Well, for this particular project, we felt that it met the aims of engaging and understanding our users' needs. It was inclusive and unobtrusive. It also presented the library as a welcoming, collaborative and community space. And it had the ability to reach a very broad demographic. They were positioned very prominently at the entrances to libraries. This also had the flip side effect of us not knowing exactly who was posing these questions. So we had to take that into account when we were analysing the data. The question that we put on the graffiti wall was, what would you ask a current student about the library? So we hoped that that would draw first-year students in so that we could understand what it is they needed from us during that induction week and beyond. Staff would then write answers to the questions that were posed on the wall, but we also could not allow other students and other members of staff to also put their responses on the wall. So it became very much a co-creative peer-to-peer tool as well as a staff to user one. It was a very open canvas, so it allowed all the students to participate, and it actually ended up being extended 1 week after induction to allow us to gain more data. Ultimately, we saw different levels of engagement at each site, and the analysis that we took from it showed that questions that people were asking about tended to centre around circulation, printing, use of space, navigation of space, and online resources. So we were able to then create a report with recommendations to inform future inductions, the possibility of creating starter packs for students, how-to guides, key one-sheet posters with this information that we'd gained from the graffiti wall. The second project that we looked at was focusing more in on our spaces specifically. So for this project, we decided to go with a photo journal, and we invited users to explore the library space on their terms and to design the future of the library. When we say photo journal, this was a slightly 2-part project. The photo journal part was a collaging session where students came together in a group and were given the tools to collage a large picture or collage of their future vision of the library. The first part of the project involved them being given an archive picture of the library, which they then had to go and match to the current space, take a picture of and send it back to us so they could see the evolution of the library over time. And that was quite interesting. We worked with archives on that project, and because the university has such a rich history and the buildings have changed so much over time, it was quite interesting to see, for students to see as well. They were very interested to see, you know, how the library had previously, I think, been a barber shop, and how these spaces had, Marylebone Library had previously been the canteen. So the evolution of space and library space was interesting to the students. The project in general allowed the students to place themselves within the library, and it allowed us to engage with them in a non-verbal manner. So much like Aimee's mentioning of the previous projects, we were able to gain a kind of a richer understanding of how they felt about the library through the visual medium, as opposed to them just trying to explain it, which often can be quite fraught with its own difficulties. We were aware that this was a smaller demographic of students being involved as opposed to the graffiti wall. but the natural conversation that occurred during the collaging session actually gave us a wealth of insight into how different students were engaging with the library and using the library. Most students commented on the greenery, or the lack of and the need for greenery in the library. The sense of community was a strong outcome from this project. Colour, inspiring workplaces, communal study spaces, and the use of student artwork. So again, that sense of identity. All of this information was then subsequently put into a report, which again had recommendations at the end, and we submitted to senior management, and it was also available to be circulated throughout the department so that people could see what the students were requiring. And hopefully some of those recommendations can be moved forward in the changes to our spaces that are constantly occurring. The third project that we began, but then got thwarted in when the pandemic hit, was Touchstone Tours. And Touchstone Tours are an observed user-led experience designed to spark engagement. So we were hoping that students would be paired with a member of staff, allocated a certain library to tour, and would tour the member of staff around the library, focusing on how they use it and the elements most important to them. This was planned to be audio recorded, and the staff would also take notes on a very visual map as the student toured them around. Unfortunately, this all occurred around the time of the lockdown in the UK, and we managed to get one tour completed the day before we were all asked to go home and work from home. So it was a real disappointment for us and for the students involved, but unfortunately there was no real feasible way we could see to move this activity online. So we did end up actually shelving this one, or we'll say postponing, because maybe at some point in the future that could hopefully get picked up again, because it's a great opportunity to hear from our students and to not assume how they're using the library, but to actually understand what aspects are important to them, and to establish some patterns, hopefully or not, between different student experiences. Aimee, can you move on to the next slide?
Yep.
And I will just briefly reflect on those three projects and what we took from those, particularly transitioning to the online work that we then had to do. So we were constantly reflecting throughout each project and the work that we were doing. We were adapting and learning as we did so. I think the key takeaways from these first projects were that we had to have a clear time frame and be very focused and organised in the work that we were doing. And it was also incredibly important to ensure staff liaison and staff investment, because with just the two of us doing this as a job share, there was an awful lot of extra work that needed to be done. We needed volunteers, and we really needed that staff engagement in order to ensure that the project succeeded. So they were two key things that we felt moving forward we needed to ensure were happening. Moving online, obviously that brought fresh challenges and an opportunity for us to learn and adjust our mindset. So this meant a shift towards more engagement opportunities, which we'll discuss in a moment. But it also highlighted that we needed to focus our minds on the importance of creating a dialogue and maintaining clear communication between ourselves and our users, to utilise an open arena to reach a broad demographic. So for us, we were able to harness the power of social media with that, because the library already had a strong social media brand established. We felt it was important to use visually appealing and dynamic images. We'd learnt that from the graffiti wall and the photo journal work that we'd done, not least in recruiting students to join in those projects, but also in delivering them once they were on board. And we also recognised a strong desire for that sense of community and identity that students were wanting. So these were all things that we felt we could take forward moving online, and focus in on and incorporate into our online UX work. Thanks, Aimee.
Great, thanks, Sinead. Yeah, so this next project was for staff, not students. So as a required part of the secondment role, we were asked to include some UX work around staff wellbeing. This was decided and planned before the lockdown, and we had planned for the core of this technique was to create an immersive and physical environment that was welcoming and quite relaxing for staff. So we had decided on using storyboarding as a technique. We had had such positive feedback from the collage sessions with students and the Future Library project that we thought it would be a really good technique to engage in, for staff to engage in. And we found it was an incredibly reflective and visually appealing practice, which we'd found had worked previously. So we wanted to create, as I said, a sort of a physically immersive environment that was outside the working environment. We knew that we wanted to do this because we knew that some staff wouldn't be comfortable knowing that the managers might see their work. We also wanted it to be completely separate from the usual everyday working experience. We wanted the staff to feel relaxed and at ease, because we really wanted them to engage in the project without any blocks we were keen to develop ways to foster engagement, which we had found was one of the hardest things of the UX work. As a service, the library had just implemented our form of flexible working. So managers wanted us to conduct wellbeing UX in order to sort of see whether this was making an impact on the staff wellbeing, what wellbeing meant to staff, and how it translated into the everyday working environment. So as Sinead mentioned, lockdown occurred at the beginning of our touchstone tours. So we were lucky in the fact that we had some time to brainstorm whether we could take the storyboarding technique that we were going to conduct in the physically immersive environment and actually see if we could bring it online. And if so, how would this look different from a physical activity? Could we still perhaps recreate an experience that prompted reflection and put staff participants at ease? We also saw a unique opportunity in taking this storyboarding online in order to capture the early days of working from home in lockdown. So the information we gathered at the beginning of lockdown would, be completely different to, say, a year's time from now. So we found that by moving everything online, we were incredibly lucky with the information that we managed to gain and harness with this technique. Also, sorry, that's the next slide. My apologies. So the storyboarding technique itself, I'll just talk about that first. So we decided that we would create a storyboard that contained 4 compartments. So these were morning, afternoon, evening, and other things I wish I'd done. We thought this captured the transition from morning at home into work, the work day, and then the transition from work to after work. The last box we included was a meaningful way to capture the new and strange existence of lockdown that we all found ourselves in. And it was other things that you'd wish you'd done. We had included that pre-lockdown, but we found that the contrast from the 3 previous boxes to the last box gave us a wealth of information about wellbeing for the staff as well. So not surprisingly, that storyboard panel, the 4th one, was including things that people were missing because of the lockdown, such as holidays, dancing, eating out, meeting friends. We found by using the narrative of storyboarding that we gained incredibly invaluable information around the way staff started their days and how they prepared themselves for work. We also saw how staff members organised their work days, and we saw how they managed to balance their workloads with their free time and their breaks. And hopefully, which the storyboards did, it showed how this contributed to their sense of well-being or their levels of stress. And it really gave us a very clear understanding of how life looked like for people when they were working from home. So finally, we were able to see how staff wind down and detach themselves from their workday, and to what degree that was clear or blurred, especially when we started working from home. All of this information helped to inform managers on how to structure work duties and the staff's workday in order to incorporate and preserve staff members' work-life balance. It was also a really great way for staff to feel that they still had a sense of team and to foster a sort of a sense of connection with their colleagues that they were still working with closely, but not seeing in the physical presence every day. So I'll just run through quickly one example of the storyboard we've got here. So you can see we've got the morning. So we've got the usual morning things before work, but we can see that the computer's already starting to appear in the morning one. So it's sort of already starting to merge with the work and non-work activities. Then we've got afternoon, and we sort of see the same thing. We've got the work activities there, and we've got the break activities as well. And then we've moved into the evening where we've got no work activities at all. But you can see what's interesting is the computer's gone from work visuals to non-work visuals. And then of course, someone here had what they'd rather be doing, which was something completely opposite to work. So just a bit more on it. As it turns out, this technique was very, very simple to translate into an online activity without losing the goals, which were reflection, engagement, and a safe space to share. The collaging technique offered a unique way to elicit self-reflection and self-expression that could be accompanied by conversation, albeit online conversations, if the participant wished to or not, depending on their comfortability level. So we found that with the previous collaging future library, that conversation was a very key part to gaining a lot of information and also fostered a lot of reflection in the participant as well. The storyboarding offered us fantastic insights and information because it offered us a narrative to someone's day. We had hoped for these reflections, and we found that the reflective approach and the use of this popular technique was kind of key to getting to the point we wanted for staff wellbeing to be expressed through the UX technique. And we found that it was probably one of the most successful techniques we'd used because it built on the success of the collaging. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Next slide. What we learned from the technique, we found that from start to finish, this really cemented the previous lessons from the past projects and allowed us to apply the learning and experience to a completely new circumstance of moving forward and moving our work solely online. One lesson learned was how important it is to make sure that the UX technique that's being implemented is the motivation for implementing this technique is completely understood. By understanding the motivation for choosing storyboarding, it allowed us for a larger degree of flexibility and allowed us to flip straight from physical to online without much problem, really. Given the way that we moved all of our work online, given that working online previously to the lockdown wasn't even an option, shows that the strength of the technique chosen and the appropriateness of the remit to the questions that we were posing made it a correct fit for the work. We were able to, being online gave us an ability to synthesize and analyze all the data we found in one place at one time. We found with UX work previously that it analyzing and synthesizing data in the physical realm could take up a lot of time and a lot of space. So we found that having all the work online meant that moving everything solely online gave us a real clear way to structure our analysis and data gathering. Going forward, we learned a lot from moving everything online, and pitfalls and the pluses, which we could apply to our future projects going forward. So we found the challenges were similar to the physical, which were engagement levels, participation levels. We really struggled with that in the physical, but we also struggled with that online as well. So we did learn quite a lot from flipping it quickly, basically being that the right technique for the right project goals were important, but also the engagement levels were just as difficult physically as they were online. And talking about engagement levels, I'll pass that on to Sinead.
I think that's perfect. Engagement is the most challenging part of UX, I think. Yes, it is the most challenging part of UX, and it became even more complex during lockdown, obviously, when everything was moved online. So to just briefly talk about our overall aim for engagement, we realizing that we had lost that physical proximity to our users, we needed to bridge that gap felt by the physical closure of our spaces. We also knew the importance of imparting our key service and support information and making sure that our users were receiving that information. And again, building upon this sense of community. We all know how much well-being and mental health has been affected by the pandemic. So that was the third part of the engagement that we felt was really, really important. So alongside the more project-based work, there was this engagement level of work as part of our secondment role, which moving online really gave us the opportunity to explore and to face the challenges of. The key message from the library in general during this period was the library is open. The library is online and the library is open. We wanted people to know that we were still there, that we were still available for them, that all the resources that they needed, to some extent we could try and provide them with. Obviously there were challenges there. The way in which that the library went about doing this was, in a sense, kind of threefold. We had online chat, which we had soft launched prior to the pandemic and going into lockdown, but obviously we saw a huge increase in the amount of people using live online chat, and that was running from 9 in the morning through till 5 in the evening, and also at weekends. So there was a huge influx in the use of that. Library Guides, which was our online platform for providing students with library-based information, previously had been most heavily used by our subject librarians to impart specific subject advice, but was now being more freely used from a customer service angle in order to ensure that, as well as getting the subject-specific advice, they were also getting the more general important library advice and the library support that they needed. So they came into play very heavily. And the third part of the process really was harnessing the social media, which I mentioned earlier. As a library, we already had established Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Aimee and I were both a part of the social media group. So this was a key element that we could play with, and we could engage with our colleagues in the group in order to ensure we were using that to the best ability. As Aimee's already said, everybody engages at a different level, and it's very difficult to know how much engagement people want to be involved with. So we tried our best to strike a balance between providing the information that people needed and not going into information overload. I think we were all getting extremely fatigued, certainly at the beginning of lockdown, if not throughout. So it was striking that balance of giving them the information they want, or at least allowing them to know where they could find that information when they needed it. Timing was very key as well. So our focus was about not overwhelming. We wanted to impart the important information, and there was a lot of liaison, not just from myself and Aimee, but from others within the library team with the wider university comms department, and making sure that key library information was included within bigger university comms that were being sent out, so that, you know, we were making sure that we were in the midst of the important university information, directing people again to the live chat, to consolidate all the key information into one library guide, so that there was one place for students to go, albeit perhaps with different tabs or links, but one place they could go where they knew they could get the information that they needed at the time. From a staff point of view, we had just introduced Microsoft Teams, so this then became a huge communication channel and a huge support between staff, between colleagues, not without its problems. That too can feel quite overwhelming, and information can get lost very easily in Teams. That was something I felt that we experienced. So again, that was very much an evolution and a learning curve, but not so much something that Aimee and I had to worry about. Within our engagement and our use of social media, which was something that Aimee and I did have a lot more control over, we turned to My Study Space and Instapolls. So for those of you that use Instagram, I'm sure you know that there's a thing such as Instapolls, which you can post on your Insta story. So we took advantage of these, asking people if there were resources that they were using that they loved, so that they would then answer our poll, and we could then share that information back to our followers, asking questions if they knew about certain things, simple yes or no poll based on that information, sharing that back, and sharing the answer to the question. So, do you know about your subject librarian? If the answer predominantly was no, then or yes, we would provide them with the information on how to find their subject librarian. So it was this kind of interactive tool that we used. My Study Space was, again, a visual project, in the sense that we asked people to share a photo of their study space, hashtag My Study Space, put that on your post and tag us in it. And then again, it was about this sense of creating a community and the fact that we were there to support, and we were kind of all in it together. Aimee, if you can move to the next slide, I think we've got some pictures of some of our submissions. Very nice. Some of our submissions for My Study Space. So pets seem to feature quite highly. We've got a little dog there peeking out, and a little cat, lovely little cat on the table there. So I think we even got a post from Spain or France, some beautiful view across the water, which I'm sure made everyone envious. But it was a nice way to have everybody engaging, staff and students actually, with our social media and with this sense of community, really. Yes, if we go on to the next one, I think I'm going to just start talking a little bit about Primo and then pass over to Aimee. So Primo Library Search. So Library Search project. During lockdown, management asked if we could have a look at Library Search and create it as a user experience project. Now, we were looking at how our users engaged with Library Search in order to determine the usability and usefulness of the catalogue. We needed to observe and analyse whether our users are able to use Library Search to its full potential, and if not, what are the barriers that are actually preventing this. So this was actually quite a large piece of work. I think perhaps even a larger piece of work than we had anticipated going into it to begin with. There's many facets and features, obviously, to using Primo. Plus, we were looking at two aspects of it. We were looking at the functionality of it, but we were also looking at the usability of it, which is obviously very user influenced and very user determined. You know, how well versed are users in using a library catalogue to begin with. Some, you know, postgraduates are going to be much more so than undergraduates. So there was a huge amount of work involved with this. So we had to think quite hard about what techniques it was that we wanted to use and how we were going to go about it. So we decided to combine some qualitative and quantitative approaches, and we went for a multifaceted three-pronged attack: observational studies, Primo analytical reports, and chat and ticket analysis. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just briefly explain what each of those 3 projects were. So observational studies, this was an actual one-to-one session. So a staff and a student were paired together, and via the power of Blackboard, they had an online discussion session where the student was asked to perform a number of searches. There was a script that we developed together. We tested initially with staff before we launched it with students. But students were asked to participate in a number of searches, a number of different ways of using library search, and they shared their screen with us. And we noted exactly how they were navigating, where they were struggling, what was happening whilst they were using library search. We also allowed for open conversations during this time. We didn't just want it to be a very prescriptive approach. So alongside those pre-designed searches, we allowed for comments, and we had discussions with students at the end. So the sessions vary depending on the student, anything from kind of 25 minutes to half an hour to, I think Aimee might have been getting over the hour at one point with one very keen student. But it was fantastic. It really enabled us to see how the users engaged, interacted, and also their habits of use, which was really important. It's looking for those patterns in how people are using the service in order to improve it. The second technique that we used was the analytical reports from Primo. We had to liaise with our Almo Primo IT colleague, Mark Kluzek, in order to draw out this information because he was the gentleman with all the knowledge. He was able to produce statistical reports for us, focusing in on things such as popular searches, the use of filters, A to Z functionality, what students were using the most, what was being used the least. Alongside this, he also used a software called Hotjar, which allowed us to see heat map reports from web pages. So that was very interesting because, again, that was a very easy visual way of seeing where people were focused mainly on library search pages. So we could see predominantly, really, it was very much at the top of the screen. There was much less scrolling going on than we'd perhaps anticipated there being. So the heat maps and the analytical reports kind of went hand in hand. And then finally, we also did some analysis on our chat and ticket transcripts. Now, these came from our chat functionality option. When we don't have live chat available, people can log a ticket and then we can respond to them within a 24-hour period or a 48-hour period, depending on the weekend. So Aimee and I took it upon ourselves to download chat transcripts for one academic year, which proved to be rather a lot. We uploaded them to the NVivo statistical software, and we were then able to analyse and categorise all those conversations that we were having with students, all that wealth of information, in order to see the patterns and areas that provoked a lot of user queries. A huge amount of them did tend to be around the access of online information. So that in itself was incredibly interesting. How could we improve people's access to that, or the troubles they were having accessing that within library search? Thanks, Aimee. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Sinead. So we wrote a report based on our recommendations and presented this to senior management. The managers were keen to utilise the findings in the report, and on the back of the report, an UX implementation group for Primo was formed. The group consists of the Primo IT contact Mark, his line manager, an academic liaison librarian, and the academic liaison librarian manager, myself and Sinead when she was at Westminster. We meet roughly every 6 weeks to work on how to realistically implement the recommendations. Recommendations were made to ensure that users don't meet barriers to accessing information in their searches, and as such, the report focused on the following identified user issues. So searching and advanced search results, the users tended to approach searching like a Google search, and the advanced search function wasn't fully understood by users. Side filter facets, These could confuse and limit searches and lead users to dead ends in their search. Terminology used, library terminology versus natural language. Databases, a lack of use of the databases. Users generally weren't aware that they existed. Icons for all the resources. Some resources in the search results list were missing icons and users commented on this. Landing page and engagement levels. Most users didn't notice the landing page or the tabs at the top of the page at all and just went straight to the search bar when opening library search. Account and request buttons. Users tended not to be able to see or find these buttons. And the record and results pages. The current hierarchy of information wasn't relevant to the students, and the terminology and word placement on the results and records pages weren't meaningful or helpful to their searches or searching for their information. So the conversations that we had with students during the observational sessions produced integral feedback for us that reinforced the need to create a search site featuring and making visible the most used functions over the least used functions. As the first step, in following the report, as a group, we focused on easy wins and then moved into deeper and more protracted work. 2 recommendations from the report resulted in deeper work and subgroups were formed. Easy wins were basic Primo changes, such as changing the button colouring for contrast, and a decision on whether to have predictive text in the search box was made. At this stage, decisions were made and implemented by Mark almost immediately. Moving on, further work was developed. Further work such as developing a more eye-catching icons and ensuring that all the entries had recognisable icons for the resource was also implemented. Those on the team familiar with Primo inputted into what recommendations were possible and what recommendations were unachievable due to Primo restrictions. So it's important to note here that one barrier to implementing the recommendations in the report is Primo itself. Our Primo IT contact Mark had been instrumental in balancing what can be changed or to what degree something can be changed within Primo's parameters. We wrote the recommendations in the report aware that Primo did have limits, but Sinead and I decided that we were going to write our recommendations regardless of these limits. And we hoped that the steering group would find a way to balance what can realistically be implemented and what can't. Deeper work came from the report around terminology and the landing page issues. Subgroups were formed around these points, work conducted and reports submitted. As a result, there has been ongoing discussions and work around the terminology used, and small changes have been made, Primo permitting. Benchmarking our landing page against other institutions was a project that was instituted by the working group, and there's now a complete overhaul of what we have on our landing page, and the overall look of the landing page is in the process of being redesigned in line with the recommendations from the report and the UX report and the recommendations from the benchmarking work the landing page group did. Finally, the group is almost at the stage for more in-depth work around the tidying up of records and results pages based on the recommendations. And this consists of various discussions from the representative viewpoints in the group on how to conduct the work. The aim is to ensure that each recommendation in the report has been addressed and implemented, if possible, in the best possible way. And that is the end of the presentation, I think. Time for questions.